What if the world's oldest civilization wasn't actually the first? In the deserts of Iraq, archaeologists found something impossible. Cities that appeared fully formed. Writing that had no ancestors. Mathematics so advanced we still use it today. But no one knows where it came from. The Sumerians didn't slowly build civilization. They inherited it. Their myths speak of teachers who came down from heaven. Their temples aligned to stars that moved millennia ago. Their flood stories match dozens of other cultures who never met. And everything, the cities, the writing, the knowledge, appears in history at exactly the same moment, as if someone pressed play on a civilization that was already designed. But designed by whom? And what happened to the original builders? If you've ever felt like human history has missing chapters, like we're living in the sequel to a story no one remembers, then you're ready for what we found. Because buried beneath 5,000 years of accepted history is evidence of something that changes everything. Please hit subscribe. The first clue is waiting. The silence was wrong. Dr. Charles Leonard Woolley had spent enough years digging through the remains of dead civilizations to know what emptiness should sound like. The quiet rustle of sand shifting through broken pottery. The hollow echo when your shovel strikes a buried wall. The whispered collapse of ancient mud brick crumbling back to dust. But standing in the excavation pit at Ur in 1922, surrounded by walls that shouldn't exist, Woolley heard something else, a silence that felt deliberate, as if someone had carefully erased every sound that might explain what he was looking at. 6 feet down, where he expected to find the scattered bones of humanity learning to build, he found perfection instead. Streets laid out in precise grids, drainage systems engineered with mathematical precision, walls that ran straight and true for hundreds of yards, their foundations cut deep into bedrock with the confidence of builders who had never known failure. This was supposed to be one of mankind's first attempts at city building, but it looked like someone had been practicing for centuries. Woolley lifted a uniform tablet from the dirt. Tax records written in neat columns cataloging grain shipments and livestock inventories with bureaucratic efficiency that wouldn't be out of place in a modern office. The clay was still warm from the desert sun, but the knowledge pressed into its surface was older than anything human civilization was supposed to possess. He stood there in that trench holding evidence that made no sense, and felt the first crack appear in everything archaeology had taught him about how societies begin. Because cities don't emerge like this. They stumble into existence over generations, leaving behind the debris of countless mistakes, collapsed walls, failed experiments, the archaeological poetry of trial and error. You should be able to trace their growth like rings in a tree, each layer showing how the builders learned from the previous generation's failures. But here, beneath 4 millennia of sand, lay a blueprint that seems to have skipped the learning entirely. The pattern repeated itself everywhere they dug. At Uruk, archaeologists had uncovered a metropolis housing nearly 80,000 people, complete with specialized districts for craftsmen, merchants, and priests. Monumental ziggurats rose from the city center like geometric mountains, their stepped sides climbing toward heaven with an architectural confidence that should have taken centuries to develop. Administrative archives recorded complex legal proceedings. Schools taught standardized curricula to young scribes. Workshops produced goods according to specifications so precise they suggested industrial-level quality control. And all of it, every system, every innovation, every leap forward, appeared simultaneously around 3200 BCE, as if someone had drawn up plans for an entire civilization and then built it in a single coordinated effort. In the lamplight of his tent that evening, Woolley spread out his drawings and tried to make sense of what felt increasingly like a magician's trick. How do you make a civilization appear without showing your work? The mathematics alone defied explanation.
The Sumerians hadn't just stumbled onto a working number system. They had created something elegant. Their base 60 mathematics allowed for complex calculations with fractions and large numbers. A system so sophisticated we still use it today when we divide hours into minutes and circles into degrees. This wasn't the kind of practical counting you develop while tallying sheep. This was theoretical mathematics, the product of minds that understood abstract principles our own civilization didn't rediscover until the Renaissance. And then there was the astronomy. Night after night, Sumerian observers had tracked the movements of planets across the sky with an accuracy that seemed impossible without telescopes. They knew Venus was a single object, whether it appeared as morning or evening star. They distinguished Saturn from the surrounding stars, despite its barely visible glow. They predicted eclipses and calculated celestial cycles with mathematical precision. Where had they learned to see the sky like that? Who had taught them to recognize patterns in the darkness that took other cultures millennia to discover? At Eridu, the city Sumerians themselves claimed was the first ever built, the mystery deepened into something approaching dread. Beneath the main temple, archaeologists had uncovered 17 construction layers, each built directly atop the last. But these weren't the random additions you'd expect from a building that evolved over time. Each layer followed the exact same architectural plan, the same proportions, the same orientation, the same careful attention to astronomical alignments. 17 times across centuries, builders had climbed these steps, measured these angles, and laid these foundation stones. 17 times they had chosen absolute fidelity over innovation, preservation over progress. It was as if they were terrified of forgetting something. Standing among those ruins today, you can feel the weight of that repetition, the obsessive precision of architects who refused to deviate from a pattern they couldn't or wouldn't explain. What were they so desperate to remember? And what were they so afraid of losing? The conventional story goes like this. Around 3500 BCE, nomadic tribes settled in the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates. Agricultural surplus led to population growth, which created the need for social organization, which eventually resulted in civilization. It's clean, logical, and fits comfortably in textbooks. But when you dig past the surface, the evidence begins to resist. Where are the failures, the experimental phase when humans were figuring out how to be civilized? Every other culture leaves behind this archaeological trail of learning, pottery that gradually improves, tools that slowly evolve, buildings that grow more sophisticated over generations. In Sumer, the earliest layers accessible to archaeologists already show remarkable sophistication. The earliest cuneiform tablets aren't primitive scratches, they're standardized records, written in organized script, complete with mathematical calculations and legal terminology. The earliest irrigation channels aren't simple ditches. They're engineered waterways with locks, gates, and distribution systems. It's like the Sumerians began their civilization at version 5.0, never bothering with the messy process of learning what version 1.0 should look like. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery is what lies beneath Sumer's foundations. Or rather, what doesn't. In the deepest layers archaeologists can reach, they don't find the ancestors of Sumerian civilization. They find absence. Not the natural emptiness of uninhabited places, but something that feels deliberately cleaned, swept, prepared. It's like walking into a house where someone has carefully removed all the family photos, leaving only the faint outlines on the walls where frames once hung. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this emptiness. Their creation myths don't describe civilization's gradual development. They tell stories of knowledge being delivered complete and perfect by beings they called the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven. The word choice is telling, not those who always were, or those who emerged from among us, but those who came down. The language suggests arrival, not origin, contact, not creation.
According to these ancient texts, the Anunnaki taught humanity the arts of civilization: writing, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture, law. Every innovation appears simultaneously in the archaeological record, as if someone had downloaded an entire cultural operating system into human consciousness. Most scholars interpret these myths as symbolic, humanity's tendency to attribute mysterious knowledge to divine intervention. But what if the Sumerians were describing something else? What if they were preserving a memory of learning, not from gods, but from teachers whose origins had been forgotten? The myths describe something the Sumerians called the Emi, divine laws or cosmic principles that weren't created, but recovered, retrieved from chaos, restored to order, rebuilt from memory. That word, rebuilt, echoes through Sumerian literature like a confession. They weren't inventing civilization, they were reconstructing it. But reconstructing it from what? And based on whose memory? Standing in the ruins of Ur, as the sun sets over the Iraqi desert, you can feel the weight of these questions. The mathematical precision of the walls, the perfect alignment of the temples, the sense that everything here was built according to plans drawn by architects who are no longer available for questions. And in that silence, that same deliberate silence Woolley first noticed a century ago, you begin to understand what's really missing from our story of human civilization. We're not looking at humanity's first cities. We're looking at its first reconstruction project, which means somewhere buried deeper than we've yet dared to dig lie the blueprints for everything we think we invented ourselves, the original plans for civilization, waiting in the darkness like a door we're not sure we want to open. Because if Sumer wasn't the beginning, if it was just the first attempt to rebuild something that came before, then every assumption we've made about human history might be wrong. All of it might be nothing more than the echoes of a memory we've been trying to forget. If that's true, we have to ask, what are we really rebuilding? Who taught us the plans? And why does the thought of finding the original blueprints fill us with a dread we can't quite name? The clay tablet trembled in Professor Samuel Noah Kramer's hands, and for a moment he couldn't tell if it was the tablet or his fingers that were shaking. It was 1956, deep in the basement archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, where thousands of cuneiform tablets sat in climate-controlled silence, waiting to surrender their secrets. Kramer had spent 30 years coaxing meaning from these ancient voices, translating the bureaucratic whispers of a dead civilization. Tax records, marriage contracts, grain inventories, the mundane poetry of people learning to organize their world with scratches in clay. But this tablet was different, not because of what it said, a routine business agreement between merchants in ancient Ur, but because of how impossibly well it said it. Every wedge-shaped mark pressed into the clay with surgical precision. Every symbol following grammatical rules so sophisticated they wouldn't be out of place in a modern linguistics textbook. Every line organized in columns that demonstrated not just literacy, but institutional memory codified in clay. The carbon dating placed this tablet at roughly 3200 BCE, making it one of humanity's earliest attempts at written communication. Except it didn't look like an attempt. It looked like a masterpiece. Kramer set the tablet on his desk with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence of a crime he couldn't quite name. Outside, Philadelphia hummed with the confident noise of modern civilization. Down here, in the artificial twilight of the archives, something whispered that humanity's relationship with writing was not what we pretended it to be. How do you invent perfection on the first try? The question had been haunting him for years, growing louder with each tablet he translated. Because uniform wasn't just functional, it was elegant. Not just communicative, but systematic. A fully realized technology for capturing human thought, deployed with the confidence of people who had never seen writing fail. And that confidence was what disturbed him most. Languages are supposed to stumble into existence. They begin as grunts and gestures, evolve into words, gradually develop grammar, slowly learn to represent abstract concepts. Writing systems should show even more evolutionary debris. The archaeological remains of people figuring out how to make marks represent sounds, how to organize symbols into meaning, how to transform the chaotic flow of human speech into something that could survive on clay. But the Sumerian record was surgically clean. Kramer walked to the archive's main catalog, his footsteps echoing in the underground chamber like whispers in a tomb. Row after row of tablets stretched into the shadows, each one a witness to the same impossible fact. Humanity's oldest writing system showed no signs of being young. He pulled another tablet from its protective housing, a legal document from Lagash that dealt with water rights between neighboring cities. The language was dense with technical terminology, legal precedents, and bureaucratic protocols. The syntax was flawless, the vocabulary precise enough to handle complex negotiations involving multiple parties, standardized measurements, and conditional clauses. This wasn't primitive communication. This was institutional sophistication crystallized in clay. And it bothered him that no one else seemed bothered by this. The conventional story, the one taught in every archaeology classroom, goes like this. Around 3200 BCE, Sumerian merchants needed to track increasingly complex transactions. Necessity mothered invention.
Simple pictographs gradually evolved into abstract symbols. Over time, these symbols began representing sounds instead of objects. Eventually, you have writing. It's clean, logical, satisfying. It's also wrong. Because pictographs, when they exist in the archaeological record, don't show gradual evolution into cuneiform. They show up sporadically, inconsistently, with no clear developmental relationship to the sophisticated script that emerges fully formed around 3200 BCE. It's like finding a few random sketches and then claiming they explain the Sistine Chapel. The evolutionary stages are missing. The transitional forms don't exist. The obvious mistakes that should litter any learning process are absent from the record. Just perfection appearing from nowhere, like a door opening in a wall you didn't know was there. Kramer returned to his desk and opened his translation notes. Pages upon pages of careful analysis that had consumed decades of his life. The more he studied Sumerian grammar, the more he became convinced that these scribes weren't inventing a writing system. They were following one. The language showed structural sophistication that seemed impossible for a first draft. Verb conjugations that handled subtle temporal relationships most languages take millennia to develop. Noun classifications that reveal deep philosophical thinking about the nature of reality. Syntactic rules, flexible enough to express everything from mundane accounting to cosmic poetry. And all of it appeared simultaneously, as if someone had downloaded an entire linguistic operating system into human consciousness. He pulled up his translations of the earliest school tablets, exercises from the Adubaba, the Sumerian tablet houses, where young scribes learned their craft. But even these educational materials troubled him. Students weren't experimenting with new ways to represent sound and meaning. They were memorizing thousands of lines of predetermined text, mathematical tables, legal formulas, religious hymns, astronomical observations. Education as preservation, not exploration. What were they preserving, and why did preservation feel so urgent? In the growing darkness of the archive, Kramer found himself thinking about silence, the particular quality of quiet that fills spaces where important things have been deliberately removed. It was the same silence he'd noticed in the archaeological record beneath the earliest cuneiform tablets. No practice runs, no experimental symbols, no evidence of a civilization learning to write. Just absence, and then suddenly, perfection. The Sumerians had a word for their writing system, sar. It meant to write, but also to place in order and to remember. The same root appeared in words for preservation, restoration, and reconstruction, as if writing itself was not about creation, but about preventing something from being lost. Not invention, salvation.
Calm closed his eyes and tried to imagine the first Sumerian scribe sitting in some long-buried chamber, pressing a reed stylus into wet clay. What had that moment felt like? The thrill of discovery, the satisfaction of invention, or the weight of responsibility? Knowing you were the last link in a chain that stretched back to teachers whose names had already been forgotten. Because the more he studied these tablets, the more convinced he became that cuneiform wasn't humanity's first writing system, it was humanity's first backup drive. The myths supported this interpretation. Sumerian creation stories didn't describe writing being invented. They described it being recovered. The MI, those cosmic principles that governed civilization, weren't created by humans. They were retrieved from chaos, restored to order,
transmitted by the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Most scholars interpreted these myths as symbolic explanations for cultural innovation, that sitting in that archive, surrounded by tablets that whispered of knowledge too perfect to have been learned from scratch, Kramer began to wonder if the Sumerians were describing something more literal. What if they weren't writing creation myths? What if they were writing user manuals? Instructions for preserving knowledge that was already ancient when the first cuneiform tablet was pressed. Guidelines for maintaining systems that had been designed by minds the Sumerians could remember only in fragments and metaphors. He opened another tablet, astronomical observations that tracked planetary movements with mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. The same scribes who recorded grain shipments were mapping the cosmos using a writing system sophisticated enough to handle both mundane accounting and celestial mechanics. From day one, what kind of culture invents writing and immediately points it toward the stars? The kind that isn't inventing anything. The kind that's trying to remember. The silence in the archive pressed against him like a weight. Thousands of tablets, millions of carefully pressed symbols, centuries of preserved knowledge. All of it feeling like an echo of something larger that had been speaking in a voice we could no longer hear. And then cuneiform simply vanished from history. Not gradually, not through evolution into other scripts, but cleanly, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, as if the backup process was complete. Kramer sat back in his chair and let the question form that would haunt him for the rest of his career. If the Sumerians were preserving rather than creating, what exactly were they trying so desperately not to forget? Because somewhere in the silence before the first tablet, something had been worth preserving, something important enough to encode in wedge-shaped marks and bury in desert sand for future civilizations to discover. Something we might still be trying to remember one translated symbol at a time. And if that was true, if the world's oldest writing system was actually a preservation project disguised as an invention, then the real question wasn't how the Sumerians learned to write, it was who taught them what to remember. The night sky above Mesopotamia in 3000 BCE was darker than anything we can imagine now. No light pollution, no artificial glow washing out the stars, just infinite blackness punctuated by thousands of points of light. Each one a mystery waiting to be solved by minds that had never seen a telescope, never held a compass, never even conceived of the wheel. Dr. Hermann Hunger knew this darkness intimately. He had spent 40 years studying ancient astronomy, translating Babylonian star charts in the climate-controlled silence of Vienna's Academy of Sciences. But on this particular evening in 1998, as he held a photograph of a tablet that would change everything he thought he knew about human civilization, Hunger felt the same vertigo that must have gripped those ancient skywatchers as they realized they were staring into infinity.
The tablet was cataloged as VAT 4956, a Babylonian copy of much older Sumerian observations. But what made Hunger's hands tremble wasn't its age, it was its accuracy. The tablet contained a complete astronomical diary for the year 568 BCE, with detailed observations of planetary positions, lunar phases, and stellar configurations. But buried in those calculations was something that shouldn't exist: mathematical precision that matched modern values to within fractions of a second. The synodic month, the time between successive full moons, was recorded as 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3.3 seconds. Modern astronomy puts it at 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 2.9 seconds, a difference of less than half a second, calculated by people who measured time with water clocks and shadows. Hunger set the photograph down and walked to his office window, staring out at the Vienna skyline while a question formed that would haunt him for years. How do you achieve that level of precision without instruments that won't be invented for 3,000 years? Because this wasn't just one lucky guess. The tablet represented the culmination of astronomical traditions that stretched back to Sumer, a continuous chain of observation and calculation that began when writing itself was barely a few centuries old. And every link in that chain showed the same impossible characteristic: accuracy that exceeded the tools available to achieve it. The Venus observations were the most troubling. Venus doesn't behave like other celestial objects. It disappears from the sky for weeks at a time, shifts dramatically between morning and evening appearances, and follows an 8-year cycle so complex that most ancient cultures never recognized it as a single planet. The Greeks called it two different stars, Phosphorus and Hesperos, and didn't realize their mistake until the 6th century BCE. But the Sumerians knew. Not only did they understand that the morning star and evening star were the same celestial body, they tracked its complete cycle with mathematical precision. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, copied from older Sumerian sources, recorded 21 years of Venus observations with data so accurate that modern astronomers use it to date ancient chronologies. How does a civilization that's just learning to write immediately begin mapping one of the most complex planetary motions visible from Earth? Hunger pulled up his translation notes, pages covered with careful analysis of cuneiform astronomical texts. The more he studied these ancient observations, the more he became convinced that something fundamental was missing from our understanding of how knowledge develops. Because knowledge is supposed to evolve gradually, astronomers should start by noticing obvious patterns: the phases of the moon, the changing position of the sun, before moving on to subtler observations like planetary motion and eclipse prediction. You expect to find crude early attempts refined over generations into increasingly sophisticated understanding. But the Sumerian astronomical record showed no such evolution. The earliest observations they made were also the most accurate. Later copies made by Babylonians and Assyrians actually showed declining precision, as if each generation understood less about what they were copying than the one before. It was backwards. Instead of knowledge improving over time, it seemed to be degrading, like a photograph of a photograph of a photograph, each copy losing resolution until the original image became unrecognizable. The mathematical sophistication troubled him most. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system that allowed for complex calculations involving fractions and angular measurements. This sexaximal system was so elegant and practical that we still use it today: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. But why base 60? Most counting systems develop organically from human anatomy. Base 10 from our fingers, base 20 from fingers and toes. It's perfect for astronomical calculations, allowing precise division of time and space without the messy fractions that plague other numerical systems.
It's as if the Sumerians designed their mathematics specifically for astronomy, or as if their mathematics had been designed by minds that already understood what astronomical calculations would require.
The star catalogs presented another puzzle. Sumerian astronomers didn't just observe celestial objects, they classified them. They distinguished between stars and planets, recognized that planets followed different paths across the sky, and grouped stars into constellations that we still use today. They understood that some stars never moved relative to each other, while others, the wandering stars or planets, traced complex paths against the stellar background. This kind of systematic observation required institutional memory spanning generations. Someone had to watch the same patch of sky night after night, year after year, decade after decade, carefully noting the smallest changes in position and brightness. And someone had to maintain those records, ensuring that the knowledge accumulated by one generation could be passed intact to the next. But where were the institutions that could support such long-term observation? The Sumerians had temples, but no universities. They had scribes, but no professional astronomers. They had cities, but no observatories. How do you maintain precision astronomical observations across centuries without the institutional infrastructure that precision requires? The silence outside Hunger's office felt different now, pregnant with the weight of questions that had no comfortable answers. In his desk drawer lay dozens of similar tablets, each one a witness to the same impossible fact. Humanity's oldest astronomical records were also its most accurate. He thought about the ancient observers themselves, standing on the flat rooftops of Sumerian cities, watching the eternal dance of lights in the desert sky. What had driven them to such patient observation? What had taught them which patterns mattered and which could be ignored? What had given them the confidence to build their entire civilization around astronomical calculations that required centuries to verify? Because that's what they had done. Sumerian agriculture depended on precise calendar calculations. Their religious festivals were timed to astronomical events. Their kings claimed legitimacy through celestial portents. Their entire culture was synchronized to the rhythm of the cosmos in a way that suggested deep, systematic understanding of how the sky worked. This wasn't casual stargazing. This was applied astronomy put to work in service of civilization itself. And it was there from the beginning, fully formed, as if someone had handed the Sumerians a complete astronomical manual and said, "Here, build your civilization around this." The myths supported this interpretation. Sumerian creation stories describe the Anunnaki teaching humanity to read the stars, to track the movements of celestial bodies, to calculate the passage of time itself. The god Marduk was said to have established the constellations and set the calendar that governed earthly affairs. Most scholars interpreted these myths as symbolic explanations for cultural innovations. But sitting in his office, surrounded by tablets that whispered of knowledge too precise to have been achieved through trial and error, Hunger began to wonder if the Sumerians were describing something more literal. What if they weren't creating astronomical mythology? What if they were preserving astronomical instruction? Because the alternative, that the Sumerians achieved mathematical and observational precision rivaling modern astronomy through nothing but patience and naked-eye observation, seemed to violate everything we knew about how knowledge develops. Knowledge builds gradually. It accumulates through countless small observations, refined over generations into increasingly sophisticated understanding. But Sumerian astronomy appeared fully formed, like a gift that came with its own instruction manual. The implications were unsettling. If the Sumerians hadn't developed their astronomical knowledge through gradual observation, then someone must have taught them.
Someone who had already understood planetary motions, eclipse cycles, and stellar positions with mathematical precision. Someone who had already solved the problems of celestial mechanics that would challenge human civilization for thousands of years. And if that was true, if Sumerian astronomy was inherited rather than invented, then we had to ask, who were the teachers? Where did they learn to read the stars with such precision? And why does their knowledge feel like an echo of observations made by minds we can no longer imagine, under skies we can no longer see? Hunger closed his translation notes and sat in the growing darkness of his office, listening to the silence that fills spaces where important questions have no comfortable answers. Outside, Vienna's lights blurred the stars into irrelevance, hiding the same cosmic dance that had captivated Sumerian observers 5,000 years ago. But those ancient watchers had seen something we had lost. They had possessed knowledge we were still trying to reconstruct. And in their careful recordings, pressed into clay tablets and buried in desert sand, they had left us a map to mysteries we didn't yet know how to read. Because if their eyes couldn't see what they recorded with such precision, we had to ask, whose eyes did? And why does the thought of finding those original observers fill us with the same mixture of wonder and unease that must have gripped the first Sumerian astronomer as he realized he was mapping infinity with nothing but clay and starlight? You check the time, 17 minutes ago. The digital display on your phone read 2:43 p.m. 2 hours, 43 minutes past noon. 60 seconds ticking by in each minute, 60 minutes accumulating in each hour, 360 degrees marking the complete rotation of Earth that creates each day. Numbers so familiar they're invisible, so embedded in the architecture of modern life that questioning them feels absurd, like asking why water is wet or why gravity pulls down instead of up. But Dr. Eliana Robson had been asking exactly those questions for 15 years, and the answers were making her deeply uncomfortable. Sitting in her office at the Oriental Institute in Oxford, surrounded by photographs of Sumerian mathematical tablets that predated Pythagoras by 2 millennia, Robson felt the peculiar vertigo that comes from realizing that something you've taken for granted your entire life has no logical explanation. Why 60 seconds in a minute? Why 60 minutes in an hour? Why 360 degrees in a circle? The answer wasn't mathematical convenience or natural observation or practical necessity. The answer was Sumer. A civilization that had been dust for 3,000 years was still governing how every human being on Earth measured time and space. And nobody could explain why their system worked so perfectly that we never bothered to replace it. Robson lifted a photograph of tablet UIBC 7289 from her desk. A simple clay square covered with uniform calculations that had changed her understanding of mathematical history.
The tablet showed a square with diagonal lines and numerical annotations that demonstrated the Babylonians knew the relationship we call the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. But that wasn't what disturbed her about the tablet. What disturbed her was the precision of the calculations, all performed in base 60 mathematics, with an elegance that suggested the system was already ancient when this particular scribe pressed his stylus into clay. Because mathematical systems are supposed to evolve. They start simple and grow more sophisticated as civilizations develop more complex needs. You expect to find primitive counting methods gradually refined into advanced calculation techniques. But Sumerian mathematics showed no such evolution. The earliest tablets contained the most sophisticated applications of base 60 arithmetic, including complex fractional calculations, tables of reciprocals, and even approximations of irrational numbers that wouldn't be formally defined until classical Greece. It was backwards, like finding the most advanced features in the first version of a software program, with later versions somehow less capable than their predecessors. The sexagemal system itself defied explanation. Base 60 was mathematically elegant, divisible by 12 different numbers, making fractional calculations simple and precise. But why had the Sumerians chosen it? Most counting systems develop organically from human anatomy. Base 10 from counting on fingers.
Base 20 from adding toes. Base 60 seemed arbitrary, until you realized its mathematical properties were perfectly suited for astronomical calculation and geometric measurement. It was as if the Sumerians had designed their number system specifically for applications they hadn't yet discovered, or as if the system had been designed by minds that already knew what those applications would require. Robson walked to her window and stared out at Oxford's ancient spires, thinking about the invisible presence of Sumerian mathematics in every aspect of modern life. GPS satellites calculated positions using coordinates measured in degrees and minutes. Computer processors synchronized operations using time measurements derived from base 60. Navigation systems guided ships and planes using angular calculations that traced back to cuneiform tablets pressed 5,000 years ago. The entire infrastructure of technological civilization was built on mathematical foundations laid by people who had never seen an airplane, never imagined a computer, never conceived of satellites orbiting Earth. Yet their numerical system worked flawlessly for applications they couldn't have anticipated. How do you accidentally create a mathematical framework perfect for technologies that won't exist for millennia? The academic community preferred not to ask such questions. The standard explanation was practical necessity. Base 60 was useful for trade and timekeeping, so it persisted through cultural transmission. But this explanation ignored the fundamental problem of origin. Where were the earlier, less sophisticated versions? Where were the competing numerical systems that should have existed during the developmental phase? Where was the archaeological evidence of mathematical experimentation and refinement? The Sumerian tablets showed no such developmental history. Base 60 appeared fully formed in the earliest mathematical texts, complete with advanced applications that suggested institutional knowledge spanning generations. It was like discovering that the first book ever written was already a masterpiece, with no evidence of anyone learning to write. Robson returned to her desk and opened a file containing her analysis of Sumerian mathematical education. The tablets revealed a sophisticated pedagogical system where students memorized vast tables of numerical relationships, multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, square and cube tables, all calculated in base 60 with extraordinary precision. But these weren't rough approximations gradually refined through use. These were exact values, calculated to multiple decimal places using techniques that modern mathematicians recognize as sophisticated numerical analysis. The students weren't learning to discover mathematical relationships, they were learning to preserve them, which raised an unsettling question. Preserve them from what, or from whom? In the silence of her office, Robson found herself thinking about the persistence of inherited knowledge, how certain pieces of information could survive the collapse of civilizations, transmitted from generation to generation, not because they were understood, but because they worked. Like genetic information, passing from parent to child, carrying instructions for processes the conscious mind never comprehended. The Sumerian creation myths describe the Anunnaki teaching humanity the May, divine laws that governed everything from kingship to craftsmanship to the measurement of time itself. Modern scholars interpret these myths as symbolic explanations for cultural innovation. But what if the Sumerians were describing something more literal? What if they were preserving the memory of actual instruction, not from gods, but from teachers whose identity had been forgotten by the time the first mathematical tablets were written? Because the knowledge encoded in those tablets wasn't just advanced, it was specific mathematical techniques, perfectly suited for astronomical calculation, numerical systems optimized for complex engineering projects, geometric principles that wouldn't be formally rediscovered until the Renaissance. This wasn't a kind of practical knowledge you develop while learning to count sheep or measure grain. This was theoretical mathematics, the product of minds that had already solved problems most civilizations would struggle with for centuries.
And yet, there it was, pressed into clay tablets by scribes who worked with the casual confidence of people following well-established protocols rather than inventing new ones. The implications were staggering. Every time someone checked their watch, they were using a time measurement system designed by unknown minds for unknown purposes. Every GPS calculation relied on angular measurements that traced back to mathematical principles embedded in cuneiform tablets. Every circular measurement, from the wheels on cars to the orbits of satellites, used a 360-degree system whose origins disappeared into prehistoric silence. Modern civilization was built on Sumerian mathematics, but nobody knew where Sumerian mathematics came from. Robson closed her files and sat in the growing darkness of her office, listening to the quiet tick of her wall clock, 60 beats per minute, marking time according to rules established before written history began. Outside, Oxford's bells chimed the hour in 12-tone sequences that echoed mathematical relationships first encoded in clay 5 millennia ago. The persistence was what troubled her most. Other ancient innovations had been improved, replaced, or forgotten. Egyptian hieroglyphics evolved into other writing systems. Roman architecture was superseded by new engineering techniques. Greek philosophy was refined by subsequent thinkers. But Sumerian mathematics persisted unchanged, as if it had achieved a perfection that couldn't be improved upon, as if it represented not human invention, but inheritance from a source that had already solved the fundamental problems of measurement and calculation. Which meant that every second ticking by on every clock in the world was marking time according to instructions written by unknown minds for unknown purposes, following mathematical principles that arrived in human history fully formed and perfect. And if that was true, if the numbers governing modern life were inherited rather than invented, then we had to ask, who designed the original system? What were they measuring so precisely? And why does their mathematics still work perfectly for applications they could never have imagined? Because somewhere in the silence before the first cuneiform tablet, someone had established the numerical rules that still govern how every human being experienced time and space. Someone had created a mathematical framework so robust that it could survive the collapse of empires, the forgetting of languages, and the transformation of human civilization from mud brick cities to spacefaring technology. Someone whose identity was now hidden behind 5,000 years of cultural transmission, but whose invisible presence could be felt every time you glanced at a clock and saw 60 seconds marking time according to their design. And why does that realization that we're still following mathematical instructions written by anonymous minds in prehistoric darkness feel less like discovery and more like remembering something we were never supposed to forget? The shadow falls exactly where it always has. Dr. Margaret Whitney stood at the base of the ziggurat of Ur, watching 4,000 years of sunlight paint the same geometric pattern across the desert sand that it had painted every winter solstice since the temple was built. The ancient bricks, crumbling and sun-bleached, still cast their shadow with the precision of a sundial, marking time according to astronomical calculations pressed into clay when mammoths still walked the earth. But this wasn't a sundial, it was something far more troubling. Whitney had spent 8 years studying Mesopotamian architecture, and the more she understood about ziggurat construction, the more convinced she became that these massive stepped pyramids weren't built for the living, they were built for memory itself. Architectural monuments designed to preserve knowledge that couldn't be trusted to human transmission alone. The question that haunted her was simple: memory of what? Because ziggurats weren't accidents of ancient engineering. They were instruments built with mathematical precision and astronomical alignment that suggested their creators understood principles of celestial mechanics most civilizations would discover for millennia. Every measurement had meaning, every angle served a purpose, every alignment pointed toward knowledge we could no longer decipher. The ziggurat of Ur rose before her like a man-made mountain, its stepped sides climbing toward heaven in carefully calculated proportions. 70 feet tall in its current ruined state, it had originally soared over 100 feet into the Mesopotamian sky, its upper platform positioned to track the movements of Venus across the night sky.
This particular temple had been built around 2100 BCE under King U-Namush, but Whitney's archaeological survey suggested it followed blueprints far older than its construction date. The foundation measurements, the staircase orientations, the astronomical alignments, all of it matched patterns found in ziggurats across Sumer, as if every builder had access to the same master plan, a plan that seemed to encode knowledge nobody could explain. She walked around the temple's base,
noting the precision of its cardinal alignment. The corners pointed almost exactly north, south, east, and west, an achievement that required sophisticated understanding of astronomy and geometry. The 3 staircases that climbed its sides faced specific celestial rising points, and the entire structure was positioned to serve as a massive observatory for tracking planetary motions. But observing what, exactly? And for whom? In the growing heat of the Iraqi morning, Whitney found herself thinking about the peculiar consistency of ziggurat construction across time and space. From Uruk to Eridu to Nippur, every major Sumerian city had built one of these stepped pyramids. Different sizes, different kings, different centuries, but the same essential design. It wasn't variation on a theme, it was repetition of a pattern preserved with the kind of obsessive fidelity that suggested the builders were following instructions they couldn't afford to misinterpret. The mathematical proportions were what troubled her most. Recent LiDAR scanning had revealed that ziggurat dimensions followed precise geometric ratios, relationships between height, width, and volume that corresponded to astronomical cycles and mathematical constants that wouldn't be formally defined until classical Greece. These weren't arbitrary architectural choices. These were encoded formulas built into brick and mortar to ensure their preservation across centuries of cultural change. But formulas for what? Whitney climbed the ancient stairs, each step worn smooth by 4 millennia of feet following the same ascending path. The climb was deliberate, designed to create specific sightlines and viewing angles that aligned with celestial events. Halfway up, she paused to examine a section of wall where clay tablets had been embedded directly into the brickwork. Astronomical observations literally built into the temple structure. This was architecture as information storage, stone and clay serving as backup drives for knowledge that someone had been desperate to preserve. The view from the ziggurat's upper platform was breathtaking in its strategic clarity. The entire Mesopotamian plain stretched to the horizon, with sightlines carefully calculated to track the rising points of stars and planets. Ancient astronomers standing here would have had an unobstructed view of celestial events, with the temple itself serving as a massive instrument for measuring cosmic time. But the alignments were wrong for the current era. Using astronomical software, Whitney had calculated that the ziggurat's orientations made perfect sense for stellar positions as they appeared 4,000 years ago, but had since drifted due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis, a phenomenon called axial precession. The temple wasn't aligned to the present sky. It was aligned to an ancient memory of how the sky used to look, which raised an uncomfortable question. How had Sumerian builders known to account for precession, a celestial phenomenon so subtle it takes advanced mathematics and centuries of observation to detect? The silence on the platform felt deliberate, pregnant with the weight of questions that had no comfortable answers. Whitney pulled out her field notes and reviewed her analysis of ziggurat construction patterns. The evidence was undeniable. These temples followed design principles that seemed to encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge, mathematical relationships, and engineering techniques that appeared fully formed in the archaeological record. No experimental phases, no developmental stages, no evidence of trial and error. Just perfection implemented with the confidence of builders who were following instructions rather than inventing techniques. The repetition across cities was what convinced her that ziggurats served a function beyond religious ritual. Each temple was essentially identical in its fundamental design, as if every Sumerian city had received the same set of blueprints and instructions for construction.
But the variations were cosmetic. Different sizes, different decorative elements, but the underlying pattern remained constant. It was like finding copies of the same book, written in different languages, preserving identical information through different cultural expressions. But who had written the original book?
And why had preservation been so important that entire civilizations dedicated their greatest architectural achievements to maintaining its instructions? The Sumerian creation myths provided clues that most scholars interpreted as symbolic stories of the Anunnaki teaching humanity to build temples that connected earth and heaven. Descriptions of divine knowledge encoded in sacred architecture, references to cosmic laws, the Mei, that governed everything from temple construction to royal succession. Whitney had always interpreted these myths as metaphorical explanations for cultural innovation. But standing on a platform built with astronomical precision that matched modern calculations, surrounded by evidence of mathematical knowledge that shouldn't have existed for centuries, she began to wonder if the Sumerians were describing something more literal. What if they weren't creating mythology about temple construction? What if they were preserving instruction about it? The silence pressed against her like a weight. Here on this ancient platform, she could feel the presence of minds that solved problems her own civilization was still working to understand. Architects who encoded knowledge into stone with such precision that their calculations still worked 4,000 years later. Engineers who had built monuments designed to preserve memory across spans of time that exceeded human comprehension. And yet their identity had been erased as completely as if they had never existed. The ziggurat beneath her feet was more than a temple. It was a message, written in the only language guaranteed to survive the collapse of civilizations, mathematics and stone. Its builders had understood that empires fall, languages die, and writing systems disappear, but geometric relationships endure. Astronomical alignments persist, mathematical ratios survive, so they had built their knowledge into monuments designed to outlast memory itself. Whitney descended the ancient stairs as the sun climbed toward its zenith, casting shadows that fell according to calculations pressed into clay tablets when humanity was supposedly just learning to write. Around the ziggurat base, tourists photographed ruins they didn't understand, standing in the presence of encoded knowledge they couldn't read. The temple still functioned, its alignment still tracked celestial events, its proportions still embodied mathematical relationships that revealed their secrets to anyone with instruments precise enough to measure them. But the meaning had been lost. The instructions had been forgotten. The memory the ziggurat was built to preserve had succumbed to the forgetting it was designed to prevent. Which meant that somewhere in the silence between what these monuments were built to remember and what we had learned to forget, lay knowledge that was considered important enough to encode in stone and preserve across millennia. Knowledge that we might still be standing on, walking past, photographing as curiosities, never realizing we were in the presence of libraries written in a language of brick and astronomical alignment, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to read what their builders had been so desperate to preserve. And why does that possibility that we might be surrounded by encoded knowledge we lack the wisdom to interpret feel less like discovery and more like an inheritance we've misplaced, a memory we've been trying to recover without knowing what we lost? Professor Sarah Chen had translated hundreds of creation myths during her 20-year career in comparative religion, and they all followed the same basic pattern. Gods create the world through force or will, establish their dominance through displays of power, and demand worship from grateful humans who owe their existence to divine intervention. But sitting in her office at Yale's Department of Near Eastern Languages, staring at a fresh translation of the Sumerian text, Enki and the World Order, Chen felt the familiar vertigo that comes from encountering evidence that doesn't fit established patterns. Because the Sumerian gods weren't behaving like gods at all. They were behaving like consultants.
The text described Enki, the god of wisdom and water,
traveling from city to city in ancient Mesopotamia. But instead of demanding tribute or punishing disobedience, he was conducting what could only be described as an organizational restructuring. He assigned specific roles to each settlement. Who would manage irrigation systems? Who would oversee brick production? Who would handle livestock breeding? Who would maintain astronomical observations? This wasn't mythology. This was project management. Chen read through the passage again, noting the peculiar specificity of the divine instructions. Enki didn't just decree that canals should exist. He explained how they should be constructed. He detailed the proper depth for irrigation channels, the optimal spacing between water gates, the seasonal timing for flood management. The text included measurements, angles, and technical specifications that read less like religious poetry and more like an engineering manual. Why were the gods giving tutorials? The question had been troubling her for months as she worked through the broader corpus of Sumerian literature. Every major figure in their pantheon seemed to govern not just abstract concepts, but specific applied knowledge domains. Enki handled hydraulic engineering and urban planning. Ninmah managed medical procedures and public health protocols. Nabu oversaw record-keeping and data management. Utu regulated legal contracts and solar timekeeping. It was like discovering that the Greek pantheon consisted entirely of university professors, each one teaching specialized courses in different branches of human knowledge. But the most unsettling aspect wasn't the specificity of their roles. It was the consistency. These weren't evolving mythologies that changed with each telling. The Anunnaki maintained the same functions, the same areas of expertise, the same detailed knowledge across centuries of cultural transmission. From Sumer to Akkad to Babylon, their job descriptions remained remarkably stable, as if they were preserving something that couldn't be allowed to change. Chen pulled up her analysis of Enki and Ninmah, a creation myth that had always troubled her. The story described the two gods experimenting with early human creation, with Ninmah molding figures from clay, while Enki provided feedback and modifications. When her initial attempts produced beings with physical limitations, the blind, the lame, the cognitively impaired, Enki didn't reject them. Instead, he carefully categorized each variation and assigned appropriate social roles based on functional capacity. Reading this as religious allegory, it seemed like a crude explanation for human diversity and social stratification. But reading it as encoded instruction, it began to resemble something else entirely. A medical classification system combined with early public health protocols.
How do you care for individuals with different capabilities? How do you integrate them into productive social roles? How do you balance individual needs with community resources? These weren't theological questions. These were practical challenges that every civilization faced, encoded in narrative form that could survive the collapse of the institutions that originally developed the solutions. The preservation method was what convinced Chen that something extraordinary was happening in these texts. In a world without mass literacy, how do you maintain complex technical knowledge across generations? How do you ensure that critical information survives political upheavals, natural disasters, and cultural transformations? You embed it in stories that people will remember, repeat, and consider too sacred to alter. The mythological framework wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate preservation strategy. By transforming technical knowledge into divine instruction, the Sumerians had created a cultural immune system that protected essential information from the natural degradation that affects purely secular knowledge. Chen opened her files on astronomical mythology and found the same pattern repeated. Marduk, the Babylonian inheritor of Sumerian cosmic traditions, wasn't just king of the gods. He was described as the deity who established the constellations and set the calendar that governs earthly affairs. The texts attributed to him contained detailed astronomical observations, mathematical calculations for predicting eclipses, and precise seasonal calendars that agricultural communities used for planting and harvesting. Modern astronomers had verified many of these calculations and found them accurate to within fractions of a degree.
But they were presented as divine decrees rather than scientific observations, wrapped in mythological language that made them easier to memorize and harder to forget. The implications were staggering. If the Anunnaki represented encoded knowledge rather than religious belief, then Sumerian civilization had developed the world's first distributed information storage system, a cultural database that could survive the destruction of physical libraries, the loss of literacy, even the collapse of the civilization that created it. But encoded memories of what? And why had preservation been considered so critical that entire mythological systems were designed around protecting technical information? Chen found herself thinking about the peculiar way these myths handled failure and experimentation. Unlike most creation stories, which described gods as omniscient and infallible, the Sumerian texts acknowledged trial and error, iterative improvement, and systematic problem-solving. Enki and Ninmah went through multiple attempts at human creation before achieving satisfactory results. Enki experimented with different approaches to canal construction before settling on optimal designs. This wasn't divine perfection. It was engineering methodology preserved in narrative form. The medical knowledge was perhaps most sophisticated. Texts attributed to Ninmah contained detailed descriptions of herbal treatments, surgical procedures, and diagnostic techniques that wouldn't be formally systematized until much later in human history. But they were presented as divine healing wisdom rather than empirical medical and knowledge. Chen had worked with medical historians to analyze some of these passages and found them remarkably accurate. Treatments described in mythological contexts often reflected sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, pharmacology, and disease progression. The success rate suggested extensive clinical experience rather than supernatural intervention. Yet this knowledge was attributed to gods, who supposedly dispensed it as a divine gift, rather than accumulated through human observation and experimentation. The legal and administrative knowledge was equally impressive. Nabu, the god of writing and record-keeping, was associated with texts that contained detailed protocols for contract law, property rights, taxation systems, and judicial procedures. These weren't abstract moral principles. They were practical legal frameworks, sophisticated enough to govern complex urban societies. Modern legal scholars who studied these texts found them comparable to legal systems that wouldn't develop elsewhere for centuries. But they were preserved as divine commands rather than human innovation, embedded in religious contexts that ensured their careful transmission across generations. In the growing silence of her office, Chen found herself confronting a possibility that challenged everything she thought she knew about the relationship between religion and knowledge in ancient civilizations. What if the Sumerian pantheon wasn't a collection of supernatural beliefs, but a sophisticated information preservation system designed to maintain technical knowledge across potential civilizational disruptions? What if the Anunnaki were never meant to be worshipped as gods, but remembered as teachers, whose lessons had been encoded in mythological form to ensure their survival? The preservation wasn't perfect. Over centuries, the technical content gradually degraded as the mythological wrapper became more important than the information it protected. Functions became personalities, systems became superstitions, instruction manuals became religious doctrines. But the core knowledge persisted, transmitted through ritual repetition and sacred narrative long after the original context had been forgotten. Which raised the most troubling question of all. If these myths were designed as preservation systems, what knowledge was so important that it required such elaborate protection? What technical information was considered so essential that entire civilizations organized their religious practices around maintaining it? And why did the original teachers, whoever they were, believe this knowledge might be lost without extraordinary measures to preserve it? Chen closed her translation files and sat in the deepening darkness of her office, listening to the quiet hum of climate control systems, maintaining optimal conditions for the preservation of ancient texts. Outside, New Haven bustled with the confident noise of modern civilization, unaware that some of its foundational knowledge might be encoded in stories it had learned to dismiss as primitive mythology. But those ancient narratives were still there, waiting in archives and libraries around the world. Patient repositories of encoded instruction, written by minds that understood something about the fragility of human knowledge and the necessity of protecting it against the forgetting that comes with time. Because if the Sumerian gods were really memories of human expertise preserved in mythological form, then we had to ask what other knowledge might be hidden in stories we've learned to interpret as fiction. What other instruction manuals might be disguised as religious texts, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to recognize technical information wrapped in sacred narrative? And why does the thought that we might be surrounded by encoded wisdom we lack the insight to decode feel less like discovery and more like recognition, as if part of us has always known we were reading the stories wrong, missing lessons that someone considered too important to lose?
Dr. Amanda Stelza had been reading Sumerian literature for 12 years, and she thought she understood the difference between mythology and instruction manuals. Myths dealt in metaphors, symbols, and archetypal struggles between cosmic forces. Technical manuals provided precise measurements, sequential procedures, and cause-effect relationships. But sitting in her office at the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, staring at a fresh translation of the creation epic Enki and Ninmah, Stelza encountered a line that made both categories collapse into something she couldn't classify. The text described the god Enki molding the first human from clay, standard creation mythology, until line 47, which specified that the clay should be mixed with water in a ratio of 3 parts to 1 and kneaded until it holds its shape without cracking. That wasn't mythological language. That was pottery instruction. And once she started looking for it, Stelza found technical specifications embedded throughout Sumerian literature, like hidden source code in what appeared to be purely narrative texts. Temple construction myths included bricklaying sequences. Agricultural stories contained planting calendars. Divine pronouncements encoded legal procedures with the precision of constitutional amendments. These weren't metaphors behaving like measurements. These were measurements disguised as metaphors. The realization was profoundly unsettling. If Sumerian myths contained functional technical information, then everything archaeology had assumed about the relationship between religion and knowledge in ancient civilizations needed to be reconsidered. Because these texts weren't just preserving spiritual beliefs, they were operating as distributed technical libraries, encoding practical knowledge in narrative formats designed to survive the collapse of the institutions that created them. Stelza pulled up her analysis of the Kesh Temple hymn, a religious text that had always struck her as oddly repetitive. The hymn praised the construction of a temple to the goddess Nintu, but instead of abstract veneration, it provided step-by-step construction procedures. Let the brick be carried. Let the foundation be laid. Let the walls rise 7 cubits. Let the reed door be hung in the sanctuary. Reading it as poetry, it seemed like ritualized repetition designed to create sacred atmosphere. Reading it as encoded instruction, it began to resemble a construction checklist that could guide actual building projects across generations. The measurements matched. Archaeological surveys of Sumerian temple foundations revealed construction techniques that corresponded exactly to the procedures described in religious hymns. The 7 cubits mentioned in mythological contexts turned out to be the standard height for temple platform foundations. The reed door specifications matched physical remains found at excavation sites. Someone had been following these mythological instructions with architectural precision. But the most troubling discovery was the me, a concept that appeared throughout Sumerian literature without satisfactory translation. Scholars usually rendered it as divine decrees or cosmic laws, but Stelza's analysis suggested something more specific and disturbing. The me weren't abstract principles.
They were discrete packets of technical knowledge. In the epic Enki and the World Order, the god Enki distributed me to different regions and cities, each one containing specific skill sets: metallurgy, irrigation, legal frameworks, astronomical observation, textile production, architectural techniques. The myths listed over 60 different MI, together comprising what could only be described as a complete civilizational operating system. And they weren't invented by humans. According to the texts, they were delivered from where? By whom? The myths provided no clear answer. Only the insistence that these knowledge modules had been transmitted to humanity as gifts that enabled the transition from primitive survival to organized civilization. Stolza stood and walked to her window, staring out at Chicago's skyline while her mind processed the implications. If the MI represented inherited technical knowledge, then Sumerian civilization hadn't developed its sophisticated capabilities through gradual innovation. It had received them as a package deal, complete with instructions encoded in mythological narratives designed to ensure their preservation across potential civilizational disruptions. The encoding mechanism was what convinced her that something extraordinary was happening in these texts. Modern memory experts used story-based techniques to retain complex information, building memory palaces where data could be stored in narrative frameworks that made abstract information easier to recall and harder to forget. The Sumerians appear to have developed the same technique on a civilizational scale, embedding technical knowledge in mythological narratives that could survive the loss of literacy, the collapse of institutions, even the forgetting of the original context, but embedded so cleverly that later generations would interpret instruction as inspiration, mistaking operational manuals for religious doctrine. Stolza returned to her desk and opened a file containing her comparative analysis of Sumerian construction myths and archaeological evidence. The correspondence was undeniable. Mythological descriptions of divine building projects matched actual construction techniques with mathematical precision. The myth of Marduk establishing cosmic order included detailed specifications for astronomical observation that corresponded to the layout of Babylonian ziggurats. Stories about Enki's water management contained hydraulic engineering principles that matched the irrigation systems found throughout Mesopotamia. Divine pronouncements about social organization encoded legal frameworks sophisticated enough to govern complex urban societies. Someone had been using these myths as functional blueprints, following mythological instructions to build actual infrastructure, which raised an even more disturbing question. If these narratives contained operational knowledge, what happened when the technical context was forgotten, but the stories persisted? The answer was all around her. Modern religious traditions preserved mythological narratives that might once have contained practical instruction, but the operational content had been lost, while the symbolic wrapper survived. Stories that were once functional had become purely spiritual, their original purpose obscured by centuries of reinterpretation.
How much technical knowledge had been lost because later generations forgot how to read instruction disguised as inspiration? In the growing silence of her office, Stelza found herself thinking about the peculiar way these myths handled process and sequence. Unlike most religious narratives, which focused on moral lessons or cosmic truths, Sumerian myths paid obsessive attention to procedural details. What happened first? What materials were required? What conditions needed to be met? What results could be expected? They read less like spiritual allegories and more like technical documentation written in narrative form to make complex information memorable and transmissible across generations of oral tradition. The repetition pattern supported this interpretation. Sumerian myths often contained multiple versions of the same basic story, with slight variations that preserved different aspects of the encoded information, like backup copies of critical files, ensuring that even if one version was corrupted or lost, the essential data could be recovered from alternate sources. And the information was precise enough to function. Temple construction myths contained architectural specifications that worked when implemented. Agricultural stories included planting schedules that corresponded to optimal growing conditions. Legal narratives encoded judicial procedures that could govern actual communities. These weren't approximate symbolic representations. These were functional, operational instructions that produced measurable results when followed correctly. Stelza closed her analysis files and sat in the deepening darkness of her office, listening to the quiet hum of climate control systems, maintaining optimal conditions for the preservation of ancient texts. Around her, thousands of clay tablets and papyrus fragments preserved the written remains of civilizations that had risen and fallen across millennia. But how much of what we called mythology might actually be technology? Operational knowledge encoded in narrative form by minds that understood something about the fragility of human memory and the necessity of protecting critical information against the forgetting that comes with time. The Sumerian texts suggested that at least one ancient civilization had developed sophisticated techniques for embedding practical knowledge in mythological narratives, creating cultural preservation systems that could maintain technical information across potential civilizational collapses, which meant that other mythological traditions might contain similar encoded instruction, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to recognize technical information disguised as spiritual narrative. Because if stories could function as machines, preserving and transmitting operational knowledge across millennia through carefully structured narrative frameworks, then we had to ask what other instruction manuals might be hiding in the myths we've learned to interpret as pure fiction. What other blueprints might be concealed in the stories we tell ourselves about gods and heroes, waiting for archaeologists and linguists clever enough to recognize that some narratives were never meant to inspire belief, but to preserve the practical knowledge necessary for rebuilding civilization itself. And why does that possibility, that we might be surrounded by encoded wisdom we lack the insight to decode, feel less like discovery and more like recovery? As if part of us has always known we were reading the blueprints wrong. The story doesn't begin with creation, it begins with erasure.
Dr. Michael Brennan had spent 15 years studying comparative flood mythologies, and the pattern never failed to disturb him. Across every continent, in cultures that had never contacted each other, the same narrative emerged with mechanical consistency. Humanity reaches a certain level of development, becomes troublesome to the gods, and gets wiped clean by water. One righteous survivor receives divine warning, builds a vessel, preserves life, and starts over on a simplified world. Not similar stories, identical structures. Sitting in his office at Harvard's Department of Folklore and Mythology, surrounded by translations from Mesopotamia, India, China, Mesoamerica, and North America, Brennan faced a question that academic archaeology preferred not to ask. How do isolated civilizations develop identical memories of global catastrophe? The conventional explanation was psychological universalism. Flood stories emerged independently because flooding was a common natural disaster that early societies needed to explain through mythology. But Brennan's analysis revealed something more troubling. These weren't explanatory myths about local flooding.
There were preservation myths about civilizational resets, and they all pointed backward towards something that had been lost. The oldest version came from Sumer, pressed into clay tablets at least 4,000 years ago. The Eridu Genesis described a time when humanity had grown too numerous and too noisy for the gods to tolerate. So the divine council decided on erasure, a flood that would wash the world clean and allow for a fresh beginning. But the god Enki disagreed with this decision. He secretly warned a man named Zuisudra, providing detailed instructions for building a vessel that could preserve life through the coming catastrophe. Zuisudra followed these instructions precisely, loading his boat with animals and supplies before the waters came. After 7 days, the flood receded. Zuisudra opened a window, sent out birds to test for dry land, and made offerings to the gods who had both destroyed and preserved the world. In return, he was granted immortality, not as reward, but as insurance that someone would remember what had happened. The details were disturbingly specific, not the vague metaphors you'd expect from ancient mythology, but practical information about disaster preparation and survival, as if the story was designed to function as instruction rather than inspiration.
And it had worked. The same narrative structure appeared in every subsequent flood tradition, from the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical account of Noah, each one preserving the essential elements: divine warning, righteous survivor, detailed instructions, catastrophic flood, mountain landing, bird reconnaissance, sacrificial offering, covenant renewal. Like backup copies of the same critical file, distributed across cultures to ensure the information couldn't be lost again. Brennan opened his analysis of flood mythology distribution patterns, maps showing how the same story had appeared in civilizations separated by oceans and millennia. The Vedic tradition of Manu and the Great Deluge, Chinese legends of Yu the Great and the Cosmic Flood, Hopi stories of the world's destruction and renewal, Incan accounts of Viroocha and the cleansing waters. Each tradition claimed the story as their own origin myth, but the structural similarities suggested they were all remembering the same event or the same trauma. Because the flood myths weren't just about water, they were about memory itself. In every version, the flood represented a break in continuity. The world before the flood was different, more advanced, more populated, more connected to divine knowledge. The world after was simpler, smaller, starting over with fragments of what had been lost. It was like reading multiple accounts of the same computer crash, each one describing the moment when everything had to be rebuilt from incomplete backups. The archaeological evidence supported this interpretation in unsettling ways. Throughout Mesopotamia, excavations revealed flood layers dating to approximately 2900 BCE. Thick deposits of riverine silt that marked the violent end of early urban settlements at Shuropak, Kish, and other Sumerian sites. These geological flood markers corresponded exactly to cultural disruption layers, where sophisticated early civilizations suddenly disappeared and were replaced by simpler societies. But the flooding hadn't been global. It had been localized to the Fertile Crescent, where the world's first complex civilizations were developing, which meant the flood myths weren't describing a planetary catastrophe. They were preserving the memory of a cultural catastrophe that had felt like the end of the world to the people who experienced it. The question was, what had been lost in those waters? Brennan found himself thinking about the peculiar characteristics of post-flood civilizations. The Sumerians who rebuilt after the Great Flooding demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that seemed to exceed what should have been possible for survivors of catastrophic social collapse. Their mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and organizational systems showed sophistication that suggested continuity with advanced knowledge rather than gradual redevelopment from primitive conditions, as if they were reconstructing something they remembered imperfectly rather than inventing something new. The flood myths themselves contained clues about what had been preserved. In every version, the survivor wasn't chosen randomly. He was selected because he possessed specific knowledge or qualities that the gods wanted to maintain through the transition. Zuyasudra was described as wise and righteous. Noah was called perfect in his generation. Manu was portrayed as a keeper of cosmic law. These weren't just moral exemplars, they were living libraries chosen to carry forward essential information that couldn't be allowed to disappear completely. And what they preserved wasn't just biological diversity. According to the myths, they carried forward the MI, those packets of civilizational knowledge that enabled the reconstruction of organized society after the waters receded. But reconstruction from what template? And why was the template apparently more sophisticated than what most post-flood civilizations managed to achieve? In the growing silence of his office, Brennan found himself confronting a possibility that challenged everything archaeology assumed about human development. What if the flood myths preserved the memory of an actual civilizational collapse so complete that it had reset human society to a pre-urban state,
forcing survivors to rebuild from fragments of knowledge they no longer fully understood. What if Sumer wasn't humanity's first complex civilization, but its first attempt at reconstruction? The mythological evidence suggested exactly this scenario.
The gods regret, after the flood, their promise never to destroy the world completely again. Their decision to use more selective pressures in the future. These weren't abstract theological concepts. They were policy adjustments, learned responses to the recognition that total erasure was counterproductive. Even the mythological minds behind the flood had realized that complete destruction led to unacceptable knowledge loss, which meant they had experience with the consequences of civilizational collapse. They had tried total reset before and discovered it was too destructive to repeat. But who were they? The myths described gods making these decisions. But if the gods represented encoded memories of human knowledge systems, then they might have been the survivors of an even earlier collapse. Teachers and knowledge keepers who understood the fragility of complex societies and the necessity of preserving critical information through catastrophic transitions. The flood myths might be describing not one collapse, but a recurring pattern of civilizational rise and fall, with each cycle preserving fragments of knowledge from the previous iteration, while losing other crucial elements to the chaos of reconstruction. And if that was true, then the flood story wasn't just ancient history, it was instruction about the present. Because modern civilization faced the same vulnerabilities that had destroyed its predecessors, dependence on complex systems that most people didn't understand, concentration of knowledge in institutions that could be disrupted, reliance on technologies that required specialized expertise to maintain. If the flood came again, whether as natural disaster, social collapse, or technological failure, how much of what we considered essential knowledge would survive? How many of our own survivors would be capable of rebuilding the systems we took for granted? And how much of what we called progress might actually be reconstruction guided by half-remembered instructions encoded in stories we'd learned to interpret as primitive mythology rather than practical warning? Brennan closed his research files and sat in the deepening darkness of his office, listening to the quiet hum of climate control systems, maintaining optimal conditions for the preservation of ancient texts. Outside, Cambridge hummed with the confident energy of modern academic civilization, secure in its assumption that knowledge once gained could never truly be lost. But the flood myths whispered otherwise. They preserved the memory of a time when advanced knowledge had been lost, when complex systems had collapsed, when human civilization had been forced to start over from fragments, and hope they contained enough information to rebuild something recognizable. And they all ended the same way, with a promise that it wouldn't happen again, coupled with the quiet understanding that promises made by human institutions
were exactly as durable as the civilizations that made them, which left one final question echoing through the mythological silence. If every culture remembered the flood, who among us was prepared for the next one? And what knowledge were we preserving in forms that could survive the forgetting that comes when the waters of chaos rise again? Dr. Janet Morrison had handled thousands of cylinder seals during her 23-year career as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But she had never encountered one that made her question the fundamental assumptions of ancient astronomy until she was asked to authenticate VA 243. The seal itself was unremarkable, a small limestone cylinder, roughly the size of a pencil eraser, carved sometime between 2500 and 200 BCE. Mesopotamian artisans had produced tens of thousands of such seals, used to roll identifying marks into wet clay for legal and administrative purposes. Most depicted conventional scenes: gods receiving offerings, kings hunting lions, scribes recording transactions. But when Morrison examined VA 243 under magnification, she found herself staring at something that shouldn't exist in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. At the center of the carved scene was a radiant star with clearly defined rays, unmistakably representing the sun. This alone was unusual.
Why would a Mesopotamian official choose to mark his signature with what appeared to be a diagram of the solar system, unless it meant something more than decoration? Unless it represented inherited knowledge, a cosmological understanding passed down through generations, even after its original context had been forgotten. Morrison pulled up her research on the broader context of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge. The evidence was undeniable. Sumerian and Babylonian astronomers had demonstrated understanding of planetary motion, eclipse prediction, and celestial mechanics that seemed to exceed what should have been possible with naked-eye observation alone. They tracked Venus through its complete 584-day cycle with mathematical precision. They predicted lunar eclipses months in advance. They understood that planets followed different paths across the sky than stars, and they developed mathematical models to predict these movements. Most troubling, they described celestial phenomena that were barely visible without telescopic aid. Saturn's rings, which appeared as handles or arms in ancient texts. Jupiter's moons, described as family members accompanying the planet. Planetary color variations that were difficult to detect without magnification. How had they acquired such detailed astronomical knowledge using only naked-eye observation? The mythological explanations provided clues that mainstream archaeology preferred to ignore. Sumerian creation myths consistently describe the Anunnaki as teachers who came down from heaven to instruct humanity in the sciences, including astronomy and mathematics. These myths contain detailed descriptions of cosmic structure, planetary relationships,
and celestial mechanics, most scholars interpreted these myths as symbolic explanations for natural phenomena. But what if they were something else entirely? What if they preserved cultural memory of actual instruction, not from gods, but from teachers whose astronomical knowledge exceeded what their students could fully comprehend or maintain? Morrison found herself staring again at the high-resolution image of VA243, noting details that became more unsettling the longer she examined them. The proportions were too accurate to be accidental. The arrangement was too systematic to be decorative. The astronomical correspondence was too precise to be coincidental. Someone had carved this seal with knowledge of solar system structure that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. In the growing silence of her office, Morrison confronted a possibility that challenged everything she thought she knew about the development of human astronomy. What if advanced astronomical knowledge had existed in the ancient world, preserved in symbolic form by cultures that no longer fully understood what they were preserving? And what if artifacts like VA243 weren't primitive attempts to represent the cosmos, but sophisticated preservation systems designed to maintain astronomical knowledge across potential periods of civilizational collapse? And if that was true, how much other ancient evidence might be waiting in museum collections around the world? Artifacts dismissed as decorative or symbolic that actually contained encoded scientific knowledge from traditions we had learned to classify as primitive mythology. The implications were staggering. Every cylinder seal, every carved relief, every piece of ancient astronomical art might need to be re-examined with the possibility that its creators possessed knowledge we had assumed was beyond their capabilities. Because if VA243 really was a map of the solar system, then someone in the ancient world understood cosmic structure with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the scientific revolution. Someone knew that Earth orbited the Sun, the planets followed predictable paths, that the solar system contained bodies invisible to naked eye observation. Someone whose identity had been lost to time, but whose knowledge had been preserved in symbols pressed into stone and clay, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to recognize instruction disguised as art. And why does that possibility, that we might be surrounded by encoded astronomical knowledge we lack the insight to interpret, feel less like discovery and more like recovery of understanding we once possessed but somehow learned to forget? The hill had been hiding in plain sight for 11,000 years. Dr. Klaus Schmidt first noticed it in 1994, driving through the arid landscape of southeastern Turkey on his way to survey other archaeological sites.
Local shepherds had always known about the strange stones that occasionally surfaced on the hilltop, but no one had thought to investigate what might lie beneath centuries of accumulated soil and debris until Schmidt started digging. What he uncovered changed everything archaeology thought it knew about the development of human civilization. Beneath that innocuous hill lay Göbekli, a complex of massive stone circles built around 9600 BCE. making it older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, older, in fact, than agriculture itself, which created a problem that archaeologists were still struggling to resolve. How do you build monumental architecture before you've learned to farm? How do you organize massive construction projects before you've developed cities? How do you create sophisticated symbolic art before you've invented writing? Standing among the T-shaped pillars on a cool morning in 2019, 25 years after the first excavation, Schmidt felt the weight of questions that had consumed his career. The megalithic structures surrounding him shouldn't exist according to every model of human development. They represented a level of social organization, artistic sophistication, and engineering capability that was supposed to emerge gradually from simpler foundations. But Göbekli Tepe had no simpler foundations. It appeared fully realized in the archaeological record, like a monument built by people who already knew exactly what they wanted to create. The pillars themselves were masterworks of Neolithic engineering. Each T-shaped monolith stood up to 18 feet tall and weighed as much as 20 tons. They had been quarried from bedrock using stone tools, transported across uneven terrain without wheels or domesticated animals, and erected with precision that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of structural engineering and load distribution. And they were covered with carvings that suggested symbolic thinking of remarkable complexity. Schmidt traced his fingers along the relief sculptures that decorated the nearest pillar. Foxes, vultures, snakes, wild boar, aurochs, and abstract symbols that seemed to follow systematic patterns. The imagery wasn't random. It appeared to encode meaning according to rules that archaeologists were still trying to decipher. The most unsettling carvings were the humanoid figures, stylized beings with folded arms, belt decorations, and what appeared to be ritual regalia. They were carved with anatomical precision that suggested the artists were working from direct observation rather than abstract symbolism. But observation of what or whom? The astronomical alignments troubled Schmidt almost as much as the symbolic complexity.
Several of the stone circles were oriented to track the rising of Sirius, while others seemed designed to mark solstices and equinoxes. This suggested that the builders possessed systematic knowledge of celestial mechanics at a time when humans were supposed to be focused entirely on immediate survival needs. How had hunter-gatherers developed sophisticated astronomy, and why had they considered it important enough to encode in monumental architecture? The more Schmidt studied Göbekli, the more convinced he became that he wasn't looking at humanity's first attempt at monumental construction. The level of planning, the sophistication of execution, the consistency of symbolic language, all of it suggested builders who were following established traditions rather than inventing new techniques. But traditions inherited from whom? And preserved for what purpose? The site's expansion patterns provided clues that made the mystery deeper. Göbekli hadn't been built all at once. Multiple stone circles had been constructed over several centuries, each one demonstrating refinements in technique and elaborations in symbolic content. The builders had clearly been working according to a master plan that evolved over generations. Yet they left no permanent settlements, no evidence of domestic architecture, no signs of the agricultural infrastructure that should have been necessary to support such massive construction projects. It was as if they had appeared, built this monumental complex, and then vanished back into the landscape, leaving behind only stones and silence.
The intentional burial was what convinced Schmidt that something extraordinary had happened at Göbekli Tepe. Around 8000 BCE, the builders had carefully covered the entire complex with tons of stone and debris, preserving it rather than destroying it. This wasn't abandonment, it was deliberate concealment. Someone had wanted to ensure that Göbekli Tepe would survive, even if the knowledge of its creators didn't. Standing in the shadow of the pillars, Schmidt found himself thinking about preservation and forgetting. The careful burial suggested that the builders had understood something about the fragility of human memory, the tendency of civilizations to lose track of their origins and purposes. They had built Göbekli Tepe not just as a monument, but as a message. And when they could no longer maintain the message actively, they had hidden it in stone and earth, trusting that future generations might eventually develop the capability to uncover and interpret what they had preserved. But preserved from what and for whom? The implications reached far beyond archaeology. If Göbekli Tepe represented the work of a sophisticated pre-agricultural civilization, then everything about the development of human society needed to be reconsidered. The standard narrative that complex culture emerged gradually from simple hunter-gatherer bands through the development of agriculture and permanent settlements was contradicted by the existence of monumental architecture that predated farming by several millennia, which raised the possibility that human civilization wasn't was far older than anyone had imagined, with roots extending back into prehistoric periods that had left few traces in the archaeological record. Schmidt walked among the stone circles, noting details that became more unsettling the longer he studied them. The symbolic consistency across different construction phases suggested cultural continuity over centuries. The astronomical alignments indicated systematic observation of celestial phenomena. The artistic sophistication revealed minds capable of abstract thinking and symbolic representation. All of it pointed toward the existence of a coherent cultural tradition that had somehow vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only this one monumental site as evidence of its existence. But if one such civilization had existed and been forgotten, how many others might have risen and fallen without leaving traces? How much human history might be missing from the archaeological record because it had been deliberately hidden, accidentally lost, or systematically erased? The silence after Göbekli Tepe's burial was complete. For 8,000 years, the site lay hidden while other civilizations rose and fell across the Middle East. The Sumerians built their cities in ziggurats. The Egyptians raised their pyramids. The Greeks developed philosophy and democracy. The Romans conquered the Mediterranean. All of them unaware that beneath a hill in Turkey lay evidence of architectural and symbolic sophistication that predated their own achievements by millennia. Which made Schmidt wonder, what if Sumerian civilization, with its sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge and complex systems, wasn't humanity's first attempt
at organized society? What if it was humanity's first successful attempt at preserving and rebuilding what had been lost when earlier civilizations disappeared? The patterns were eerily similar. Both cultures had appeared with remarkable sophistication already intact. Both had demonstrated knowledge that seemed to exceed their supposed developmental stage. Both had shown obsessive concern with preservation and memory, as if both were working to maintain something that couldn't be allowed to disappear again. In the growing twilight, Schmidt stood among the ancient pillars and felt the weight of 11,000 years of silence. The stones around him were older than written history, older than the earliest cities, older than the agricultural revolution that was supposed to have made civilization possible. They were monuments to a way of thinking and building that had somehow developed among human beings who were supposed to be living in small, scattered groups focused entirely on survival. But the evidence was undeniable.
Here, carved in stone and buried with care, was proof that human capability and cultural sophistication extended much further back in time than anyone had imagined. And if that was true, then everything about the origins of knowledge, the development of civilization, and the relationship between past and present needed to be reconsidered. Because Göbekli Tepe whispered the same message that echoed through Sumerian achievements, that human civilization might not represent a gradual ascent from primitiveness, but a process of recovery from sophisticated origins that had been almost, but not entirely, forgotten. And why does that possibility that we might be remembering rather than discovering, recovering rather than inventing, feel less like revelation and more like recognition of something we had always suspected, but never dared to acknowledge?
As Finkel had learned through decades of research, the loss of ancient knowledge followed predictable patterns. When empires fell, new rulers systematically destroyed the archives of their predecessors. When religions changed, theological libraries were burned as heretical. When languages shifted, old scripts became unreadable and their tablets were discarded as worthless clay. Knowledge wasn't just forgotten, it was actively erased. The process had continued through history with depressing consistency. The Library of Alexandria, repeatedly damaged by political upheaval and religious conflict. Mayan codices systematically burned by Spanish conquistadors who considered them demonic. Islamic texts lost during Mongol invasions. Each destruction represented the same fundamental dynamic. The past became dangerous to the present, so the present eliminated the past. But the loss was more subtle than dramatic acts of destruction. Much ancient knowledge disappeared through simple neglect. Scribes stopped copying texts that seemed irrelevant to contemporary needs. Libraries stopped maintaining collections that no longer served political or religious purposes. Archives were abandoned when the institutions that created them lost power or influence. The result was a kind of cultural Darwinism, where only knowledge that served immediate needs survived, while deeper understanding was gradually filtered out of the historical record. Finkel returned to his desk and opened a file containing his analysis of missing Sumerian literature. Based on references in surviving texts, scholars could reconstruct the titles and approximate contents of hundreds of lost works.
astronomical treatises, mathematical commentaries, mythological cycles, historical chronicles, technical manuals. The Sumerians had apparently written comprehensive guides to metallurgy, agriculture, medicine, law, and engineering. They had composed epic poems that made the surviving literature look like fragments of larger cycles. They had created mathematical works that pushed the boundaries of theoretical understanding. All of it gone, leaving behind only tantalizingly brief references in the few texts that happened to survive. What haunted Finkel most was the realization that much of what modern archaeology considered mysterious about Sumerian civilization might not have been mysterious at all. The sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge, the advanced understanding of astronomy and mathematics, the complex organizational systems, all of it might have been clearly explained in texts that were lost when their libraries burned. We called Sumerian achievements mysterious because we were missing the instruction manuals. The pattern repeated throughout ancient history. Every civilization that demonstrated advanced capabilities also left evidence of extensive literary and scientific collections that didn't survive. The mystery of their achievements was often simply the mystery of their missing libraries. In the growing darkness of his office, Finkel found himself thinking about preservation and forgetting as active processes rather than passive accidents. Someone had decided what deserved to survive and what could be allowed to disappear. Someone had chosen which texts to copy and which to abandon. Someone had determined which knowledge served the interests of power and which represented a threat to established order. The process was still happening. Modern libraries discarded books that seemed outdated. Digital archives deleted files to save storage space. Institutional memory disappeared when organizations restructured. Knowledge that didn't fit contemporary frameworks was quietly removed from circulation. The flood that had nearly destroyed human civilization hadn't been made of water. It had been made of fire and forgetting, conquest and censorship, neglect and deliberate erasure. And it was still rising.
Finkel closed his research files and sat in the silence of the archive, surrounded by thousands of clay tablets that had survived against impossible odds. Each one represented knowledge that someone had considered important enough to preserve in permanent form. Each one had been created by hands that understood the fragility of memory and the necessity of encoding crucial information in materials that could outlast biological recall. But they had also understood something else, that preservation required intention. Knowledge didn't survive automatically. It survived because people made deliberate choices to maintain it across generations. The Sumerians had tried to write down everything they considered important. They had created redundant copies. They had distributed their libraries across multiple cities. They had embedded crucial information in myths and rituals that could survive even if the written records were lost. They had understood that civilization was always one library fire away from amnesia. And they had been right. Most of what they had tried to preserve was gone,
leaving behind only fragments that hinted at the scope of what had been lost. Their mathematical achievements survived in scattered tablets. Their astronomical knowledge existed in incomplete observations. Their mythological understanding was preserved in stories that had been copied and recopied until the original meanings were obscured. But enough had survived to reveal the outline of something extraordinary, a civilization that had achieved remarkable understanding of the natural world and had tried desperately to pass that understanding to future generations. They had failed, mostly, but their failure had been partial rather than complete, leaving behind just enough evidence to suggest what we might have known if the libraries had survived. And why does that possibility that we are living with the intellectual impoverishment that comes from systematic knowledge destruction feel less like historical tragedy and more like ongoing catastrophe, as if the flames that consumed ancient libraries are still burning, still reducing human understanding to ash and dust, and the fading memory of wisdom we once possessed but learned to forget? Professor Elena Kazakova stared at the uniform sign on her computer screen until her eyes began to water. After 15 years of teaching Sumerian language and literature at Columbia University, she thought she understood the limitations of ancient translation. But sitting in her office at 2 a.m, surrounded by competing interpretations of a single word, Kazakova felt the familiar vertigo that came from realizing how much meaning could be lost in the space between languages. The word was Anunnaki, and it appeared in thousands of texts across millennia, but no two scholars agreed on what it meant. The traditional interpretation rendered it as gods or divine beings, the standard translation that appears in most textbooks and museum displays. But the root etymology suggested something more specific. Anunnaki, which could be broken down as those of Anu who are upon the earth, or offspring of the sky god who came down, or simply the princely seed. Each translation carried radically different implications about the nature of these beings and their relationship to humanity. Kazakova opened her research files and scrolled through the competing scholarly interpretations that had developed over the past century. Religious scholars favored metaphorical readings that emphasized the Anunnaki's symbolic rather than literal significance. Mainstream archaeologists treated them as mythological personifications of natural forces. Alternative researchers argued for historical interpretations that portrayed them as actual beings who interacted with ancient humans. Same words, same tablets, completely different stories. The problem wasn't limited to Anunnaki. Sumerian literature was filled with terms whose meaning shifted depending on who was doing the translating and what theoretical framework they brought to the process. The word me, traditionally rendered as divine decrees, could also be interpreted as cosmic laws, cultural programs, or technological packages.
The term Eden, usually translated plain or steppe, carried linguistic connections to the Hebrew Eden that some scholars embraced and others rejected. Each translation choice created cascading effects throughout the interpretation of Sumerian civilization, turning the same texts into evidence for completely different theories about ancient history. The fundamental challenge was that Sumerian was a dead language in the most complete sense possible. It had left no living descendants, no native speakers, no oral traditions that could clarify ambiguous passages. The pronunciation was largely guesswork based on later Akkadian borrowings. The grammar was reconstructed from limited examples. The cultural context that would have made metaphors and idioms comprehensible had vanished along with the civilization that created it. Modern translators were essentially archaeologists of meaning, attempting to reconstruct not just words, but entire conceptual frameworks from fragmentary evidence. Kazakova pulled up her analysis of a particular tablet that had caused decades of scholarly debate. The text described the Anunnaki descending from heaven to take counsel with humans about the governance of cities. Traditional interpretation rendered this as a mythological account of gods establishing divine kingship, but alternative readings suggested it might describe actual historical meetings between different groups of people, with heaven representing elevated social status rather than celestial origin. The difference wasn't academic. It represented fundamentally different understandings of whether Sumerian texts preserved mythological allegory or distorted historical memory, and there was no objective way to decide between them. The ambiguity was built into the nature of ancient writing itself. Sumerian scribes had written for audiences that shared their cultural assumptions, their religious frameworks, their understanding of historical context. They hadn't needed to explain the basic premises of their worldview because everyone already knew them. But those shared assumptions had died with the civilization that held them, leaving behind texts that operated according to logic modern readers could no longer fully access. Kazakova found herself thinking about the political dimensions of translation. Academic careers were built on particular interpretations of ancient texts. Research grants depended on proposals that promised to clarify historical questions. Museum exhibitions required definitive explanations that could be presented to public audiences. The pressure to choose definitive meanings for ambiguous words was enormous, even when the evidence didn't support certainty. The result was a kind of intellectual colonization of the past, where modern ideological frameworks were projected backward onto ancient texts that might have operated according to completely different conceptual systems. Religious scholars found confirmation of spiritual truths. Rationalist archaeologists found evidence of mythological thinking. Alternative researchers found suggestions of suppressed historical realities. Everyone found what they were looking for because the gaps in understanding were large enough to accommodate almost any interpretation. The Anunnaki had become a perfect example of this phenomenon. In popular culture, they had been transformed into everything from benevolent space visitors to malevolent genetic manipulators, depending on which translation choices modern authors preferred. Academic scholars dismissed these interpretations as pseudoscience, but their own translations were often equally speculative, just expressed in more cautious language. The original meaning, whatever it had been, was lost somewhere between the ancient scribes who wrote the words and the modern translators who tried to decode them. In the growing silence of her office, Kazakova found herself confronting the unsettling possibility that much of what scholarship claimed to know about Sumerian civilization was actually educated guesswork dressed up as authoritative knowledge. The confident assertions in textbooks and academic papers often rested on translation choices that were far more uncertain than their presentation suggested, which meant that the mystery of the Sumerians might not be a mystery of missing evidence, but a mystery of irretrievable meaning.
The texts had survived, but the cultural context that would make them comprehensible had been lost as completely as if it had been deliberately erased. The words were still there, pressed into clay with the same care that had shaped them 4,000 years ago. But the intentions behind those words, the assumptions that had given them meaning, the shared understanding that had made communication possible, all of that had vanished, leaving behind symbols that could be read but not truly understood. Modern scholars were like visitors to a foreign country who had learned to pronounce the local words without understanding the culture that gave those words significance. They could read the signs, but they couldn't decode the meaning that the signs had carried for the people who created them. And perhaps that was the deepest loss of all. Not just the destruction of libraries or the forgetting of techniques, but the erosion of meaning itself, the slow dissolution of the conceptual frameworks that had made ancient knowledge comprehensible to ancient minds. The Anunnaki might have been gods or kings or teachers or visitors or symbols or memories. The evidence could support any of these interpretations, and scholarly debate would likely continue for generations without resolution. Because the one thing that could settle the question, the living voice of someone who had been there, who had understood what the words meant when they were written, was the one thing that could never be recovered. Kazakova closed her research files and sat in the darkness of her office, listening to the quiet hum of the computer that held thousands of possible meanings for words that had once possessed single definite significance. Outside, New York hummed with the confident noise of a civilization that believed it understood its own language, its own intentions, its own relationship to truth. But how much of what seemed clear and definite today would become ambiguous and contested if future archaeologists tried to reconstruct its meaning from fragmentary evidence? How much certainty was actually interpretation, and how much interpretation was actually imagination filling the gaps where knowledge failed? And why does that possibility that we might be living in our own age of mistranslation, reading signs we think we understand, but whose true meaning has already begun to slip away, feel less like academic concern and more like existential warning about the fragility of all human understanding? Dr. Robert Hassan had been working in the basement archives of the British Museum for 6 months when he made a discovery that would define the rest of his career. Not because of what he found, but because of what happened when he tried to talk about it. The tablet was catalogued under the identifier BM145793. It is a Sumerian administrative text dated approximately to 2400 BCE. It had been sitting in storage since 1923, photographed but never fully translated, filed away in the vast institutional memory of one of the world's most comprehensive archaeological collections. Hassan was a junior research fellow tasked with the unglamorous work of creating digital catalogs for uncategorized artifacts. His job was to provide basic descriptions, not groundbreaking analysis. But when he began translating the cuneiform signs on tablet BM145793, he found himself staring at something that challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient Mesopotamian astronomy. The tablet contained precise calculations for planetary orbital periods that shouldn't have been possible with Bronze Age observation techniques. Not approximations or rough estimates, but mathematical values that matched modern measurements to within decimal points. Hassan double-checked his translation, consulted with senior colleagues, and ran the calculations through contemporary astronomical software. The ancient values were correct in ways that seemed to require instrumentation far beyond anything the historical record suggested the Sumerians possessed. When he submitted his preliminary findings to his department supervisor, the response was swift and discouraging. Interesting, but probably not worth pursuing for publication. These kinds of anomalous readings usually turn out to have mundane explanations.
Hassan never published his research. The tablet was refiled in storage, and 6 months later, his fellowship was not renewed. Sitting in his cramped office at a regional university 3 years later, Hassan had come to understand something about academic institutions that wasn't taught in graduate school. Silence was often policy disguised as methodology. The problem wasn't censorship in any dramatic sense. Nobody had forbidden him from studying anomalous tablets or pursuing unconventional interpretations. The restriction was subtler and more effective. Certain kinds of research simply weren't supported, funded, or rewarded within the existing institutional framework. Grants went to projects that promised to clarify established historical narratives, not challenge them. Publication opportunities existed for work that built incrementally on accepted theories, not research that suggested those theories might be fundamentally flawed. Academic positions were awarded to scholars who demonstrated expertise within recognized specializations, not those who crossed disciplinary boundaries or questioned basic assumptions. The result was a kind of intellectual ecosystem that selected against disruptive discoveries, ensuring that only research compatible with existing paradigms received the resources necessary for development and dissemination. Hassan opened his files on untranslated Sumerian texts and felt the familiar frustration that had driven him from prestigious institutions to academic obscurity. Conservative estimates suggested that less than 20% of recovered cuneiform tablets had been fully translated and published. The remainder sat in museum collections around the world, catalogued but unread, photographed but unstudied.
Some contained routine administrative records, grain inventories, tax receipts, legal contracts, but others included references to unknown deities, unfamiliar astronomical observations, mathematical techniques that didn't match established understanding of ancient capabilities. These anomalous texts weren't hidden or classified. They were simply ignored, left in storage while scholarly attention focused on materials that fit comfortably within accepted historical frameworks. Hassan had encountered dozens of such tablets during his brief tenure at major institutions. Clay fragments that described engineering techniques supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations. Astronomical observations that required precision instruments. Mathematical calculations that anticipated discoveries attributed to much later periods. None of it was studied seriously because none of it was fundable, publishable, or career-enhancing within the current academic environment. The institutional pressures were understandable from a practical perspective. Universities operated on limited budgets and competitive markets. Scholars needed to produce publishable research to maintain employment. Departments required grant funding to justify their existence. Museums had to balance scholarly investigation with public programming and donor relations. Revolutionary discoveries were risky investments that might not pay off. Incremental research was safer, more reliable, more likely to produce measurable outcomes within acceptable time frames. But the cumulative effect was the creation of knowledge gaps that couldn't be explained by missing evidence. Some questions remained unanswered, not because relevant information didn't exist, but because investigating those questions was institutionally discouraged. Hassan found himself thinking about the broader implications of academic gatekeeping. How much potentially transformative research was never conducted because it fell outside established funding priorities? How many anomalous artifacts were sitting in storage because they didn't fit comfortable interpretations? How many patterns were invisible because they required interdisciplinary approaches that didn't align with departmental structures? The answers were unknowable, which was exactly the problem. The things that weren't studied remained unstudied, creating blind spots in human knowledge that persisted not because of evidential limitations, but because of institutional ones. The irony was profound. Modern scholarship had developed sophisticated techniques for recovering and interpreting ancient information. Archaeological methods could extract meaning from the smallest fragments. Linguistic analysis could decode dead languages with remarkable precision. Digital technology could preserve and cross-reference vast datasets with unprecedented efficiency. But all of these capabilities were constrained by human institutions that operated according to logic quite different from pure knowledge-seeking. Academic careers, funding priorities, publication pressures, and institutional politics shaped what questions were asked and what answers were permitted. The result was a kind of systematic forgetting that operated in real time. Not the accidental loss of information through fire or conquest, but the deliberate filtering of information through bureaucratic processes that determined what deserved attention and what could be safely ignored. Hassan closed his research files and walked to the small window of his office, looking out at the modest campus where he now taught introductory courses to undergraduates who would probably never hear about the anomalous tablets he'd discovered, the questions he'd wanted to pursue, or the institutional barriers that had prevented him from doing so. In the growing silence of the afternoon, he found himself wondering how many other researchers had encountered similar evidence and faced similar choices. How many had decided that career stability was more important than disruptive discovery? How many had learned to ask only the questions that academia was prepared to answer? The academic world prided itself on rational inquiry and evidence-based conclusions, but rationality operated within institutional contexts that were far from neutral. What counted as valid evidence, legitimate methodology, and acceptable interpretation was determined by human communities with their own interests, assumptions, and blind spots, which meant that even in an age of unprecedented access to information, certain kinds of knowledge could become effectively invisible, not because they were false or unimportant, but because they were inconvenient to the institutional structures responsible for validating and disseminating human understanding. The silence wasn't the absence of evidence, it was the presence of choice. The collective decision to look in some directions and not others, to ask some questions and not others, to preserve some possibilities and quietly abandon others. And perhaps that was the most troubling realization of all. The forgetting that had erased so much ancient knowledge wasn't just a historical process that had ended with the development of modern scholarship. It was an ongoing dynamic that continued to shape what contemporary civilization chose to remember and what it chose to forget. Because in the end, the greatest threat to human knowledge might not be fire or conquest or natural disaster, but the simple bureaucratic decision to file certain questions under not worth pursuing and leave them there, gathering dust in the archives of institutional indifference. And why does that possibility, that we might be living through our own age of systematic forgetting, losing understanding not through catastrophe, but through administrative neglect, feel less like academic criticism and more like civilizational warning about the fragility of curiosity? Dr. Margaret Chen had been studying civilizational development for 28 years, and she thought she understood how human societies evolved. Small groups learned to farm. Farming villages grew into towns. Towns developed into cities. Cities created writing systems, legal codes, and religious institutions. It was a logical progression that explained the rise of every major civilization she had studied, except one. Standing in the reading room of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, surrounded by tablets, charts, and translation notes that represented decades of research into Sumerian civilization, Chen felt the weight of accumulated evidence that pointed toward a conclusion she couldn't quite bring herself to accept. The Sumerians hadn't followed the rules. They hadn't climbed slowly from primitive beginnings to sophisticated achievement.
They had appeared in the historical record with capabilities that should have taken centuries to develop, knowledge that should have required generations to accumulate, and institutional systems that should have emerged gradually through trial and error. Instead, they had arrived fully formed.
Chen walked to the display case containing photographs of the earliest Sumerian tablets dated to around 3200 BCE. These weren't crude experiments in communication. They were polished documents written in standardized script, following established grammatical rules, recording complex transactions using sophisticated numerical systems. The earliest examples of human writing showed no learning curve. She moved to the astronomical charts that mapped Sumerian knowledge of planetary motion. The calculations were precise enough to predict eclipses, track Venus through its 8-year cycle, and create calendars that accounted for the complex relationship between lunar months and solar years. The earliest examples of human astronomy demonstrated accuracy that wouldn't be matched for millennia. The mathematical tablets told the same story. Sumerian numerologists had developed a base 60 system, elegant enough to handle complex fractions, advanced enough to calculate square roots, and practical enough that modern civilization still used it to measure time and space. The earliest examples of human mathematics contain techniques that modern students struggled to master in every domain. Chen examined the pattern repeated. The Sumerians hadn't gradually developed their capabilities. They had implemented them as if they were working from instructions rather than experimenting with possibilities. The urban planning was the most unsettling evidence. Ancient cities usually showed archaeological layers that revealed gradual growth, small settlements expanding into larger ones, early buildings replaced by more sophisticated structures. Infrastructure added piece by piece as populations grew and needs became more complex. But Sumerian cities showed different patterns. They appeared to have been planned from the beginning, with sophisticated drainage systems, organized districts, and monumental architecture that suggested their builders understood urban engineering principles from the moment construction began. Uruk hadn't grown into a city, it had been built as one. Chen returned to her desk and opened her comparative analysis of civilizational development timelines. Every other ancient society showed clear developmental phases. Egypt's pre-dynastic period preceded the unified kingdom by centuries. China's Neolithic cultures evolved gradually into historical dynasties. Mesopotamian societies before Sumer demonstrated slow progression from scattered villages to larger settlements. Only Sumer broke the pattern, appearing suddenly with capabilities that exceeded those of civilizations that had supposedly learned from Sumerian examples. The technological sophistication was undeniable. Sumerian metallurgists had developed smelting techniques and alloy recipes that required understanding of chemistry and physics. Their medical practitioners had created surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations that demonstrated systematic knowledge of human anatomy. Their engineers had built irrigation systems and architectural monuments that required mathematical precision and structural understanding.
All of it emerged simultaneously, as if someone had activated multiple knowledge systems at once, rather than developing them sequentially through gradual innovation. But perhaps the most telling evidence was what hadn't survived in the archaeological record. Every other ancient civilization left traces of its developmental phase. Crude early tools that evolved into sophisticated instruments. Simple buildings that grew into complex architecture. Basic art that developed into refined expression. The Sumerians left no such traces. Their earliest artifacts were already sophisticated. Their first buildings were already engineered. Their initial art was already symbolic and complex. It was as if they had skipped the learning phase entirely. Chen found herself thinking about the implications of what she was seeing. If Sumerian civilization hadn't developed gradually, then either the Sumerians were unprecedented geniuses who had somehow invented complex society from scratch, or they had inherited their knowledge from sources that were no longer visible in the archaeological record. The first possibility seemed to violate everything known about human cognitive development and social evolution.
The second possibility suggested that much of what archaeology assumed about the origins of civilization was wrong. But there was a third possibility that Chen found even more unsettling. That Sumerian civilization represented not innovation, but recovery. That their remarkable capabilities weren't the result of sudden inspiration, but of systematic preservation of knowledge that had been developed elsewhere earlier by minds whose identity had been lost to time. The mythological evidence supported this interpretation. Sumerian creation stories consistently describe civilization as something delivered rather than discovered. The Anunnaki were portrayed as teachers who provided pre-existing knowledge rather than gods who inspired human innovation. The Me were described as cosmic principles that were recovered rather than invented. If these myths preserved cultural memory rather than pure fantasy, they suggested that Sumerian civilization had been designed to maintain knowledge systems that predated its own existence. Chen walked to the window and stared out at the Chicago skyline, thinking about the broader implications of what Sumerian evidence suggested about human history. If one ancient civilization had achieved remarkable sophistication and then disappeared so completely that only fragmentary knowledge survived in later reconstructions, how many others might have followed the same pattern? How much human history might be missing from the archaeological record because it had been systematically erased, accidentally lost, or deliberately hidden? The silence in the archive felt different now, pregnant with the weight of questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about human development. If Sumer represented recovery rather than innovation, then the entire timeline of civilizational progress needed to be reconsidered, which meant that modern civilization might not represent the pinnacle of human achievement, but simply the latest attempt to recover capabilities that had been lost and regained multiple times throughout history. The thought was both humbling and terrifying. Humbling because it suggested that human potential was far greater than contemporary achievements indicated. Terrifying because it implied that even remarkable civilizations could disappear so completely that later societies would have no memory of their existence. And if that was true, then the most important question wasn't how the Sumerians had achieved so much so quickly, but how much knowledge modern civilization might be forgetting while congratulating itself on its unprecedented sophistication. Chen closed her research files and sat in the growing darkness of the reading room, surrounded by evidence of human capabilities that exceeded what should have been possible for their historical context. Around her, thousands of tablets preserved fragments of knowledge systems that had somehow appeared fully formed in the archaeological record, flourished for centuries, and then gradually faded as later civilizations lost the ability to maintain what they had inherited. It was a pattern that felt less like ancient history and more like contemporary warning. Because if the Sumerians had been rebuilding from incomplete memories of something even greater that had been lost, we had to ask, what were we rebuilding from? And what were we losing while we focused on what we thought we were discovering? And why does that possibility that we might be living through our own cycle of recovery and loss, preserving fragments while forgetting foundations, feel less like academic speculation and more like recognition of something we had always suspected but never dared to acknowledge about the true relationship between human memory and human potential? The clay tablets sit in climate-controlled silence, waiting in museums across the world, in private collections, in storage rooms that haven't been opened in decades. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, each one pressed with symbols that once carried meaning across the ancient world. Each one a fragment of something larger that we've learned to call mythology instead of memory. But what if we've been reading the story backward? What if civilization isn't a mountain we're climbing, but a circle we keep entering? What if progress isn't linear ascent, but cyclical recovery? What if every time we think we're discovering something new, we're actually remembering something old? The Sumerians appeared in history like a door opening in a wall we didn't know was there. Cities without prehistory, writing without evolution, mathematics without learning curves, knowledge systems so sophisticated they governed our world 5,000 years later, yet so mysterious we couldn't explain where they came from. They called their teachers the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven. We call that mythology. But maybe mythology is just history that survived the flood, encoded in stories because stone tablets couldn't preserve what really mattered. The understanding that knowledge itself is fragile, that civilizations rise and fall, that memory can be deliberately erased. And maybe that's what the Sumerians really left us. Not just the first writing, the first cities, the first laws, but the first warning encoded in every myth about floods that washed the world clean, hidden in every temple built to preserve what couldn't be allowed to disappear,
whispered in every story about gods who once taught humanity and then left. Because if you wanted to hide the most important truth in human history, where would you put it? In a library that could burn? In a language that could die? In institutions that could fall? Or would you embed it so deeply in the foundations of civilization itself that even when everything else collapsed, even when the libraries burned and the languages died and the institutions crumbled, the truth would still be there, waiting in the shadows of every story we tell ourselves about where we came from? The Sumerians knew something we've forgotten, that forgetting isn't accidental, it's systematic. It's the natural consequence of believing that what we have can never be lost, that what we know can never be forgotten, that what we've built can never fall. But everything falls, everything burns, everything floods, except the stories we tell in the dark when we think no one is listening. And maybe that's where the real truth is hiding, not in the tablets we've translated, but in the silence between the words, not in the myths we've decoded, but in the memory they're still trying to preserve. Because somewhere in that silence, something is waiting to be remembered. Something that knows we've been here before. Something that's watching us forget.